The will reading was a joke to everyone but Madeline. They laughed when she got the rotting house on Ash Street instead of the family trust. But the laughter died the day she wedged open a false floorboard in the attic and realized Grandma Beatrice wasn't crazy. She was hiding a multi-million-dollar secret. The mahogany-paneled office of Harrison and Associates smelled of lemon polish and old money, an aroma that Madeline Hayes found utterly suffocating. She sat on the very edge of an overstuffed leather chair, acutely aware of the frayed cuffs of her thrift store blazer. Across the room, occupying the velvet sofa like a pair of reigning monarchs, sat her Aunt Patricia and her cousin Richard. Patricia wore a bespoke charcoal suit that likely cost more than Madeline's car, her face a carefully curated mask of Botox and boredom. Richard, idly checking his Rolex every 3 minutes, sighed with the profound impatience of a man missing his afternoon tea time. They were all there for the final testament of Beatrice Gallagher, the matriarch of a family that had built its fortune in Pennsylvania steel and real estate. Beatrice had been a formidable woman, sharp as a diamond, until her final 5 years, when the family whispered that she had lost her mind, becoming a paranoid recluse who hoarded newspapers and talked to the walls. "Let us proceed, Mr. Harrison," a silver-haired attorney with a voice like dry gravel, adjusted his spectacles. He began to read through the sprawling estate. It went exactly as Madeline had anticipated. Patricia inherited the sprawling Manhattan penthouse and the liquid assets housed in offshore accounts. Richard was handed the keys to the commercial real estate portfolio in downtown Philadelphia and the family's summer estate in Newport. They smiled tight, self-satisfied smiles. Madeline, the daughter of Beatrice's disowned youngest child, expected nothing. She was only there out of a stubborn sense of duty to the grandmother who used to sneak her butterscotch candies before the family froze her out. "And finally," Mr. Harrison said, clearing his throat, his eyes darting uncomfortably toward Madeline. "To my granddaughter, Madeline Hayes, I leave the property located at 714 Ash Street, Scranton, Pennsylvania, along with all its contents, on the condition that she does not sell the land for exactly 1 year. A heavy silence fell over the room, instantly shattered by Richard's sharp, barking laugh. "The Ash Street house?" Richard choked out, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Is that thing even still standing? I thought the city condemned it a decade ago." Patricia's lips curled into a sneer of profound pity. "Oh, Madeline, dear, I am so sorry. Mother really did lose her faculties at the end. That house is a biohazard. The property taxes alone are in the thousands, and there's a lien on it. You'd be better off tossing a match through the front window and claiming the insurance, if it even has any." Madeline's cheeks burned. She was currently drowning in $30,000 of medical debt from her own mother's final illness, facing eviction from her cramped apartment in 3 weeks. She had foolishly, secretly hoped her grandmother might have left her a small cash stipend. Instead, she had been handed a dilapidated liability. "I'll take it," Madeline said softly, her chin lifting. "Don't be absurd," Patricia scoffed, standing up to collect her designer handbag. "Sign the deed over to the city. Walk away. It's a worthless money pit, Madeline. You don't have the funds to fix a broken window, let alone a rotting Victorian monstrosity." "I said I'll take it," Madeline repeated, her voice firmer this time. 2 days later, Madeline parked her sputtering Honda Civic in front of 714 Ash Street, and immediately understood why Richard had laughed. The house was a terrifying silhouette against the grey Scranton sky. It was a massive, 3-story Victorian relic that had been surrendered to the elements. The slate roof sagged under the weight of decades of neglect, missing tiles looking like knocked-out teeth. The wraparound porch was choked by a jungle of dead, thorny, overgrown rose bushes, and the paint, once a cheerful canary yellow, was peeling off in long, grey scabs. The windows were opaque with grime, some boarded up with rotting plywood. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Madeline killed the engine. The silence of the dying neighborhood pressed in on her. The houses on either side were equally derelict, victims of the town's collapsed industrial economy. She stepped out of the car, the chilly autumn wind biting through her thin sweater. Armed with a heavy ring of brass keys Mr. Harrison had given her, she waded through the waist-high weeds of the front yard. The wooden steps of the porch groaned in agony under her weight. She fumbled with the rusted deadbolt on the heavy oak front door. With a violent shove, the door gave way, scraping harshly against the hard wood floor inside. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over her. It smelled intensely of mothballs, damp earth, and decaying paper. She stepped into the foyer and gasped. It wasn't just dusty, it was a labyrinth of hoarding. Stacks of yellowed newspapers formed chest-high walls in the hallway. Cardboard boxes, old clothes, and broken furniture were piled haphazardly into the living room. It was a chaotic monument to Beatrice's final, paranoid years. "What were you doing, Grandma?" Madeline whispered into the gloom. As she navigated through the narrow pathways her grandmother had carved through the junk, Madeline noticed something deeply unsettling. Every single interior door, the door to the kitchen, the door to the parlor, the door to the downstairs bathroom, had heavy, modern deadbolts installed on them, and they were all locked from the outside. Whatever Beatrice had been afraid of in her final years, she had been trying to lock it in. Or lock it out. Madeline couldn't tell which was worse. She had 1 month before her apartment lease was up. 1 month to clear out this disaster, fix the bare minimum, and somehow find a buyer crazy enough to take this nightmare off her hands, despite the 1-year clause in the will. If she failed, bankruptcy was her only remaining option. For 2 agonizing weeks, Madeline lived out of a sleeping bag in the only relatively clean room on the ground floor, what used to be a formal dining room. Her days became a grueling blur of heavy lifting, dust masks, and industrial trash bags. She rented a dumpster and filled it 3 times over with rotting fabric, broken lamps, and endless, nonsensical stacks of mail dating back to the 1980s. Yet, as she cleared away the superficial layers of madness, the house began to reveal an eerie sort of logic. Beatrice hadn't just been hoarding randomly. Madeline found bizarre handwritten notes taped to the undersides of tables and the backs of mirrors. They check the accounts, but they don't look down. One note read in Beatrice's shaky, spidery cursive. "Richard is a vulture. Patricia is a snake. Trust the wood," read another, found stuffed inside a hollowed-out dictionary. Madeline tried to dismiss them as the tragic ramblings of dementia. But the vitriol aimed at her aunt and cousin felt startlingly lucid. The real turning point came on a Tuesday night. The local weather channel had warned of a severe nor'easter, and by 9 p.m. the storm slammed into Scranton with terrifying violence. The wind howled through the cracked window panes, and rain lashed against the siding like handfuls of gravel. Madeline was huddled in her sleeping bag, reading by the light of a camping lantern, because the house's ancient electrical grid had shorted out an hour prior. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the rumble of the thunder. Drip, drip, drip. It was heavy and consistent, coming from the hallway right outside her door. She groaned, grabbing her lantern and a plastic bucket. She walked into the hall and shone the light upward. Water was steadily pouring through a crack in the plaster ceiling, pooling rapidly on the warped oak floorboards. "No, no, no," Madeline muttered. If the water damage spread, the house would go from fixer-upper to condemned teardown by morning. She had to find the source. The leak was coming from the second floor, which meant she had to go up. But when she reached the second floor landing, the ceiling there was leaking too. The water was cascading straight down from the third floor. The attic. Madeline stared at the narrow, claustrophobic door at the end of the hall. Beatrice had always been terrifyingly strict about the attic. Even when Madeline was a little girl, visiting for Thanksgiving, the attic was strictly forbidden. "There are rats up there that will bite off your pretty little fingers," Beatrice had once hissed, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. Swallowing hard, Madeline approached the door. It was secured by a heavy iron padlock, but the latch was so rusted it was literally pulling away from the rotting door frame. Madeline went downstairs, grabbed a crowbar from her meager toolkit, and marched back up. With a sickening crunch of splintering wood, the latch gave way. Madeline kicked the door open. A rush of freezing, musty air hit her face. She raised her lantern and ascended the steep, narrow wooden stairs. The attic spanned the entire length of the massive house. It was a cavernous space, the exposed wooden beams arcing overhead like the ribcage of a leviathan. Unlike the floors below, the attic wasn't hoarded with trash. It was strangely sparse. A few dress forms draped in dusty white sheets stood in the corners like silent ghosts. Rain drummed deafeningly against the slate roof just inches above her head. She tracked the water to a far corner, where a missing shingle was allowing a steady stream of rainwater to pour straight onto the floor. She rushed over, sliding the plastic bucket beneath the stream. As she stepped back, her boot caught the edge of a floorboard. She stumbled, nearly dropping the lantern. Regaining her balance, she shone the light down at her feet. The floorboard she had tripped on wasn't just loose. It was noticeably raised, sitting about half an inch higher than the rest of the tongue and groove pine planks. Frowning, Madeline knelt. She tapped her knuckles against the wood. Thud. She tapped the board next to it. Thunk. She tapped the raised board again. It didn't sound solid. It sounded distinctively hollow. Her grandmother's crazy notes flashed through her mind. They check the accounts, but they don't look down. Trust the wood. Heart hammering against her ribs, Madeline wedged the flat edge of her crowbar beneath the raised plank. She put her weight into it. The old iron nails screeched in protest, a sound that made her teeth ache, and then the board popped free. Madeline gasped, aiming the lantern into the dark cavity between the floor joists. Resting in a bed of undisturbed dust, suspended on a false bottom beneath the floor, was a steamer trunk. It was relatively small, bound in dark leather, and reinforced with heavy brass rivets that had turned green with age. With trembling hands, Madeline reached into the cavity and hauled the trunk out. It was shockingly heavy, weighing at least 40 pounds. She dragged it away from the leaking roof and into the center of the attic. The trunk was sealed with a complex, vintage brass padlock. Not a cheap, rusted thing, but a heavy-duty mechanism that looked custom-made. Adrenaline surging through her veins, entirely forgetting the storm raging outside. Madeline raised the crowbar. She brought it down on the padlock with a heavy clang. It held. She swung again, harder this time, putting all her frustration, her debt, and her anger at Patricia and Richard into the strike. The brass lock shattered. Madeline dropped the crowbar. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the smell of dust and old leather filling her lungs. She unlatched the heavy brass clasps and threw back the lid. There were no ghosts inside. There was no trash. The trunk was lined with heavy, waterproof oilcloth. Madeline peeled back the stiff fabric. Beneath it lay neat, brick-like bundles bound in twine. Madeline pulled one out and stared at it in the lantern light. It was a stack of currency, but not modern money. They were pristine, mint condition, $500 and $1,000 bills. Some of them bore dates from the 1920s and 1930s. There were dozens of bundles. But the cash wasn't the treasure. Beneath the money lay a series of thick, leather-bound ledgers. Madeline pulled the top one out and opened it. The pages were filled with her grandmother's handwriting, but not the frantic, shaky scrawl of her final years. This was the sharp, precise calligraphy of a much younger Beatrice Gallagher. The first page bore a heading: "The True Holdings of the Gallagher Estate, Hidden from Richard Sr." Tucked inside the front cover of the ledger was a heavy, tarnished silver key bearing an intricate family crest, and a single sheet of modern typed paper. It was a letter, addressed simply to "The One Who Looked Down." Madeline read the first line, and the blood drained from her face. If you are reading this, Patricia and Richard believe they have taken everything. They haven't even scratched the surface. The empire they inherited is built on a lie. The real empire belongs to the holder of this key. Madeline's hands shook so violently that the typed pages rattled like dry leaves in the drafty attic. She read the letter by the flickering light of her camping lantern, while the nor'easter continued to batter the slate roof above her head. "If you are reading this," the letter continued, "then you possessed the one trait I feared the rest of my bloodline lacked: grit. Patricia and Richard are parasites, Madeline. They spent their entire lives waiting for me to die, hovering like vultures over a carcass they hadn't even earned the right to consume. But they underestimated me. They mistook my age for weakness, and my silence for dementia." Madeline swallowed hard, her eyes devouring her grandmother's sharp, unforgiving words. "Your grandfather, Richard Sr., was a ruthless man who built his fortune on the backs of underpaid mill workers and shady real estate deals. When he died, the empire passed to me. I knew what Patricia and my son would do with it. I knew they would expand the greed. So for the last 30 years, I began a quiet demolition. I heavily mortgaged the commercial real estate portfolio Richard inherited. I funneled the liquid assets Patricia believes are safely tucked away in the Caymans into highly volatile, ultimately doomed shell corporations. I left them a hollowed-out tree, primed to collapse in the next strong wind." Madeline gasped. The Manhattan penthouse, the offshore accounts, the Philadelphia commercial properties. They were a trap, a financial time bomb Beatrice had spent decades meticulously constructing. But the true wealth, the letter revealed, the untainted, clean assets that I slowly siphoned away and legally separated from the Gallagher estate, belong to whoever opens this trunk. The cash in this box is merely to settle your immediate debts and fund your travel. The silver key belongs to Private Vault 804 at the J.P. Morgan Chase main depository on Wall Street in New York. The password is your mother's middle name. Do not trust the family lawyers. Do not trust Mr. Harrison. Trust only the ledgers in this trunk. They contain the true deeds, the bearer bonds, and the controlling shares of Apex Global Holdings, a company no one knows I own. The Ash Street house was merely a test to see if you would look beneath the rot. Congratulations, Madeline. You are the sole heir to the real Gallagher fortune." The storm outside seemed to fade into a dull hum compared to the roaring in Madeline's ears. She sat on the dusty floorboards for hours, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what lay before her. The heavy ledgers beneath the stacks of vintage currency detailed an empire. Apex Global Holdings owned prime, unencumbered real estate in London, Tokyo, and San Francisco. There were records of untraceable municipal bonds and flawless investment-grade diamonds. Beatrice hadn't lost her mind. She had orchestrated the most brilliant, slow-burn financial assassination in the history of Pennsylvania society. When the sun finally broke through the grey clouds the next morning, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the attic, Madeline was a different woman. She packed the cash and the ledgers into a heavy duffel bag. She dragged the empty trunk back into the floor cavity, replaced the wooden board, and hammered the nails back into place with a rock. 3 days later, Madeline stepped off a train at Penn Station in New York City. She had used a portion of the vintage cash, exchanged carefully at a series of different banks to avoid suspicion, to pay off her mother's medical debts in full. She was wearing a new, sharp navy trench coat, her posture straight, the heavy silver key burning a hole in her pocket. The J.P. Morgan Chase building in Lower Manhattan was a fortress of polished granite and hushed reverence. Madeline bypassed the main teller lines and approached the private wealth management desk. She requested access to Private Vault 804. The bank manager, a severe-looking man named Mr. Covington, eyed her with practiced skepticism. "Ma'am, that vault has been sealed for over 15 years. I will need to see the physical key, your identification, and we require the verbal passphrase established by the original leaseholder." Madeline placed the heavy, tarnished silver key on the glass desk. The manager's posture immediately stiffened. "The password," Madeline said softly, her voice steady, "is Genevieve." 10 minutes later, Madeline stood alone in a sterile, stainless steel viewing room deep beneath the streets of Manhattan. A massive metal lockbox sat on the table in front of her. She inserted the silver key and turned it. The mechanism gave a satisfying, heavy clack. She lifted the lid. It was breathtaking. Row upon row of municipal bearer bonds, financial instruments that functioned as cash, completely untraceable and wholly owned by whoever held the physical paper. Beneath them were velvet pouches heavy with cut diamonds, and thick manila envelopes containing the certified notarized deeds to international properties, all legally transferred into the name of a dormant trust, of which Madeline was now the sole beneficiary. A conservative estimate, based on the ledgers, put the contents of the box and the associated trust at well over $80 million. Madeline closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cool metal of the box. She thought of her mother, who had died worrying about hospital bills. She thought of Beatrice, spending her final years surrounded by trash to keep her greedy children away from her masterpiece. "I won't let you down, Grandma," Madeline whispered. It took exactly 6 months for Beatrice's trap to spring. Madeline had spent that half-year quietly organizing her new empire. She hired a ruthless, fiercely loyal wealth management firm in Geneva to handle the bearer bonds and offshore trusts, entirely bypassing the American legal system that her aunt and cousin relied upon. She began the slow, expensive process of restoring the Ash Street house, transforming it from a rotting hazard into a stunning, historically accurate Victorian showpiece. She owed the old house that much. Meanwhile, the financial markets in Philadelphia took a sharp downturn. It was a minor recession, but for an over-leveraged portfolio, it was a death sentence. The commercial properties Richard had inherited began bleeding money. When he tried to refinance, the banks discovered the massive, hidden secondary mortgages Beatrice had secretly taken out decades prior. A cascade of margin calls followed. Within weeks, Richard's real estate empire was in receivership. Patricia didn't fare any better. The IRS, tipped off by a highly suspicious and fully intentional paper trail Beatrice had left behind in her private study, froze the Cayman Island accounts, pending a massive federal audit for tax evasion. Patricia's credit cards were declined at Bergdorf Goodman. Her Manhattan penthouse was slapped with a lien. Desperation makes arrogant people dangerous, but it also makes them stupid. Madeline's phone rang on a brisk Tuesday morning in April. It was Mr. Harrison, the gravel-voiced attorney. "Madeline," he said, sounding remarkably less condescending than he had at the will reading. "Your aunt and cousin have requested an urgent meeting. They wish to discuss the Ash Street property. They believe there may be a way to pool your resources to save the family legacy." Madeline smiled, staring out the newly restored bay window of the Ash Street house. "Tell them I'll be there at 2:00. The mahogany-paneled office of Harrison and Associates smelled exactly the same, but the power dynamic had violently shifted. Richard looked 10 years older. He had bags under his eyes, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. Patricia was devoid of her usual haughty makeup, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a lukewarm cup of coffee. When Madeline walked in, neither of them laughed. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, a subtle, deliberate mirror of the outfit Patricia had worn on the day they mocked her. She carried a sleek leather briefcase, which she set on the table with a soft thud. "Madeline?" Richard started, his voice strained, attempting to project an authority he no longer possessed. "I'm glad you came. We are facing some temporary liquidity issues. A misunderstanding with the banks. We know the Ash Street house is likely a burden to you. We have a developer willing to buy the land to build a parking garage. It won't be much, but if you sign the deed over to my holding company today, we can use the capital to clear our margin calls, and we will cut you a check for $20,000. Patricia leaned forward, attempting a warm, maternal smile that looked entirely grotesque on her face. "It's the right thing to do, dear. For the family." Madeline let the silence stretch. She looked at Richard, then at Patricia, and finally at Mr. Harrison, who was shuffling papers uncomfortably. "The Ash Street house is not for sale," Madeline said. Her voice was calm, devoid of anger or pity. "In fact, the restoration is nearly complete. The foundation has been reinforced, the roof is slate again, and the original oak floors have been brought back to life." Richard's face flushed dark red. "Are you insane? Where did you get the money for a historical restoration? You were drowning in debt." "Madeline, listen to me. We are about to lose everything. The Philadelphia properties are being seized by a creditor." "I know," Madeline said smoothly. She clicked open her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder, sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward Richard. "They are being seized by Apex Global Holdings." Richard froze. He stared at the folder, then slowly opened it. He scanned the legal documents inside. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. "What is it, Richard?" Patricia snapped, grabbing the paperwork. She read the cover page and gasped. "Apex Global Holdings," Madeline explained, leaning back in her chair and crossing her legs. "A private trust. I am the sole proprietor. I bought up your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar 3 weeks ago, when your primary lenders panicked. I own the mortgages on your commercial portfolio, Richard. And Patricia, I purchased the lien on your Manhattan penthouse." "That's impossible," Mr. Harrison stammered, abandoning all professional decorum. "You had nothing. The estate you managed was a decoy, Mr. Harrison," Madeline interrupted, her gaze turning cold. "My grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. She knew Richard Sr. built this family on greed, and she knew you two would destroy each other fighting over the scraps. So she let you have the scraps, the leveraged, toxic, rotting scraps." "You set us up!" Richard roared, standing up, his chair crashing to the floor behind him. "You orchestrated this." "I did nothing," Madeline replied calmly, not flinching. "Grandma Beatrice set the board. I just found the pieces. You were handed a crumbling empire because you never bothered to look beneath the surface. You saw a crazy old woman and a worthless house. I saw a grandmother who was trying to tell me something." Patricia buried her face in her hands, letting out a ragged, humiliated sob. Madeline stood up, buttoning her jacket. The foreclosure notices will be formally served to both of you tomorrow morning. You will be evicted from the penthouse, Patricia. Richard, the Philadelphia properties will be liquidated to pay off the debts you owe me. You will both be left with nothing. Exactly as you intended for me. She turned toward the door, pausing with her hand on the brass knob. She looked back at her family one last time. They looked small, pathetic, and finally awake to the reality of their own ruin. "Oh, and Richard?" Madeline said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "If you need a place to stay, I hear there's a lovely, fully restored Victorian on Ash Street. But the rent is quite steep." Madeline walked out of the office, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind her. She stepped out onto the bustling streets of the city, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The Gallagher family curse was finally broken, and for the first time in her life, Madeline's future was entirely her own. What would you do if you discovered a multi-million-dollar secret hidden in a worthless inheritance? Madeline's incredible journey proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are disguised as the heaviest burdens, and that karma always comes to collect. If this story of hidden wealth and ultimate revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping true stories.